So you heard a fair amount about the mechanics of programs, so I'm going to minimize that a bit and try to add some more food for thought to get us going for our upcoming conversation. To do that, we'll cover the basics of the policy, some of the trends that we've observed in energy performance across the city of San Francisco, and some updates that have modified either the benchmarking ordinance or built on it, as well as some ongoing work looking at what next steps are appropriate, since in line with the prior presenters, this is an effort predominantly motivated on the part of the city to reduce carbon emissions. So the shortest, sweetest way to talk about the San Francisco's ordinance is it was originally adopted as the existing commercial buildings ordinance back in 2011. It applies both to municipal and private sector buildings and requires annual benchmarking and public disclosure of energy use, as well as an energy audit or retrocommissioning by a qualified professional at least once every 5 years. The disclosure and the applicability does apply to buildings regardless of number of meters. The only criterion that limits participation or being affected by the program is the two are occupancy. So if the building is not zoned but actually has a building code occupancy and active manufacturing use, then it has an exemption. And if it's smaller than the size threshold of 10,000 square feet, then it's not affected by the ordinance. Some highlights of what we've observed in the years since it was adopted. First, we really want to call out our counterparts at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission are responsible for benchmarking our municipal portfolio, totaling 49 million square feet, including the San Francisco Unified School District. Across that portfolio, energy upgrades, particularly from natural gas efficiency improvements and more recently electrification, have cut the portfolio annual carbon emissions by a quarter. They're just like any other party managing a large portfolio, just the process of benchmarking did uncover specific opportunities and kind of data eccentricities. The most amusing one, just to share that we have the same sort of challenges as the private sector, and we definitely observe these in the private sector, is, we'd been paying energy bills on a fire station that we'd sold a number of years before. If we pivot and look at citywide, zoom out to the commercial private sector, in recent years we've observed and enjoyed the benefit of the economic growth until very recently. And in that context, improvement in commercial property value, total employment, and the counter trend of absolute energy consumption declining by about 11%. The data, because San Francisco's ordinance has been in operation for a number of years, data is published as required. It's available in a relatively raw form at the city's open data portal, Data SF. And you're also welcome to visit our website. And if this URL looks a little ponderous, you can shorten it to sfenvironment.org/EBO. And that we have a full interactive report that allows you to drill down into the data set by building use, building size, look at trends. You can find any one building. In this example, just highlighted one Bush Street and its performance using the energy star scale relative to other office properties in San Francisco. Because San Francisco is one of the communities that's been running a benchmarking program and disclosing data for a number of years, it does also afford some other opportunities in addition to helping building owners manage their own buildings. It also gives a chance for discussions like we're having today, as well as learning from our peers in other cities across the nation around the world, because benchmarking is now required in at least 29 US cities and about a half dozen other communities around the world. Where there are policies in other nations, of course, the details vary. And but just to make use of the fact that we had common data and that there are, for example, large office buildings in are a common feature of large cities. C40 worked with its member cities to assemble benchmarking data and just look at, what have been the trends in percent change in energy use relative to the energy use in the first year that they're adopted a program. And there are all sorts of caveats with this, so I just want to highlight this as a report rather than to point you to it, but rather than to highlight that San Francisco might come off as being a little smug, given that the sum total of energy efficiency program activity run by our department, run by the utilities, supported by the architecture and engineering community, and of course the implementation of the energy code, all in total have contributed to a very promising trend. But also that transparency and comparing data across communities gives a chance to look farther afield and recognize that there are some benefits, some strong benefits to taking different approaches than are common. And so this highlights how, just as a teaser, Sydney, Australia has had a much greater emphasis than San Francisco has, and I think than most US cities have had, on direct and ongoing engagement and support for their private sector, and a focus on this improving efficiency in central systems. Whereas Tokyo adopted essentially a mandatory energy performance standard well before any of us talked about it, and has had a great deal of success with that program. In implementing San Francisco's ordinance, the original challenge was access to utility data. It actually delayed final adoption of the ordinance, which was developed in 2009 but withheld until 2011. And when it was put into place, it was just the building owner's responsibility to obtain data access. And we were both participated in and grateful that the state of California took action clarifying that utilities are obligated to provide data for the purpose of benchmarking. And so that's been a great benefit from 2017 or 2018 onward. But it's created new challenges where the data quality that the utilities provided there's more opacity. It's harder to tell if the data is complete because data access under AB 802 involves summing up all the energy usage for all of the meters for a given fuel type, and so provides limited insight into energy consumption. And that really contributed to a lot of the issues that Ben talked about earlier. And we've been in brief responding to those by detailed review of our staff of all the data that we do receive, and we reject any benchmark that has any evidence of being incomplete, and have done so from the outset, as well as using the audit mechanism as a validation, requiring the auditor to review the data in the benchmark and stand behind it if they find it accurate, or to tell us what needs to be improved. And as a result, we do both. I would both agree with Ben's point that there are always significant imperfections in the citywide data set, and we have a lot of confidence that the data is of similar quality to anywhere. And it's definitely valuable for decision making, and for both city decision making as well as for the individual building owner. Last, the audit itself has, anecdotally, there have been a lot of great examples of the audit uncovering savings, including some owners who were particularly unenthused to have an audit mandate applied and did act on that information. There's also ample evidence of the opposite. And so it's not necessarily clear that there's a trend or the impact of the audit and the connection between being required to perform an audit at a particular time to comply with the city requirement and the period of time that an owner may have the resources and the openness to act on that. They just may not coincide. In 2019, the ordinance was revised to better align with AB 802. So it was expanded to apply to mixed-use buildings as well as multifamily buildings. And in the case of multifamily and mixed use, only benchmarking is required, not an audit. But similar to the original ordinance, the number of meters is not a basis for exemption, and the and condominium properties are not exempted in San Francisco, so they are subject to San Francisco's ordinance. Also in 2019, a complementary law was passed, basically recognizing that two things, that the 9% of our buildings that are the largest commercial buildings account for 73% of total commercial electricity usage. And second item is 100% renewable electricity is widely available through the meter via the CCA and even from PG&E and other utilities. Happy to explain that offline, but there's a wide variety of options that you can get 100% renewable electricity at a very competitive price with no capital investment. And so the city, to put some teeth behind its goal of 100% renewable energy by 2030 citywide, began to phase in a requirement that commercial buildings must purchase 100% renewable electricity. And so in summary, the ordinance has some different requirements based on building scale and size. It does affect the vast majority of energy use in San Francisco and the vast majority of total floor area, but does not apply to single family or small multifamily buildings. Now, if we look to the future for a moment, we've been recently engaged with stakeholders through a zero emission buildings task force, asking the question, we know we've benefited from efficiency, and there's been a lot of emission reduction over the years in San Francisco, but how do we get to our long-term goals together? So, asking stakeholders, what would be the best method to achieve Mayor Breed's commitment to ensure that all new construction has zero emissions no later than 2030, and that all existing buildings operate with zero emissions no later than 2050. And we do think both of those dates can be moved up significantly. But the question is when, where, and with what messages can we best engage and help the private sector? And that includes policy, definitely does not exclude it, but policy is not the only instrument of that change. And really it is trust and empowerment, we think, is a critical component, as well, of course, as equity. And so for context, in talking with our local stakeholders, we emphasize that we look at the total built environment of San Francisco on an annualized basis. The operational emissions from all buildings citywide in San Francisco have gone down. They're 50% lower than they were in 1990. And a huge fraction of that is the growth of renewable electricity on the grid, as well as local incentives and requirements for renewable generation on site, as well as the energy code and many layers of efforts at voluntary efficiency and leadership on the part of private sector owners and investors, as well as programs that, for example, the city itself has been engaging and offering systematically for going on 20 years. And the result of the sum total of that effort is 80% of current emissions are derived from gas usage. So we can't get to fixing that problem purely through efficiency, nor purely through improving renewable electricity access. And so we engage with stakeholders to ask, how are we going to get there? And really to recognize that there are different ways that we could, as a community, get to meet our emission reduction goals, and that the main criterion is electrification. So it's the emissions directly derived from on-site fossil fuel use is the y-axis. And if we took no action today, we would not meet our goals. If we wait and to meet our goals, we'd have to take a very aggressive path, and that's the illustrator's difficult intervention here. If we just simply translate our goals into a average reduction pathway, that's steady progress. And so the question we've been asking is, how do we do better? How do we both use policy and incentives and engagement and any other tools that are helpful to improve equity and access, support a just transition, and proactively empower our partners across the community to get this done, because we need to. And there are some cross-cutting themes. The discussion's been had in different work groups looking at specific issues specific. There's a lot of specificity. Anyway, we've broken the task down into work groups that are sector specific. And there are some cross-cutting themes, and that's what I'm going to highlight here. So one is that electrification is strongly aligned with both financial benefit as well as our community's values, supporting racial and social equity and we, at this point, economic recovery. Next, that it's really critical that the city communicate about the future, that we are going to achieve the mayor's goals and our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. And the question is how, rather than whether we'll achieve those goals. And to do so, how best can we be a partner and send aligned messages rather than erect barriers to taking the actions necessary. A key recommendation has been that we need to take advantage of the fact that there's both capital investment cycles inherent to different categories of real estate. Particularly and you have this in your home, your water heater wears out, and you're going to want to plan in advance for that change in order to be able to support the switch to a heat pump. Analogous things apply with maybe a little more fancier spreadsheets, but they apply from largest commercial buildings down to multifamily in each sector. And so what's really critical is anticipating those changes and where the opportunities to make a change are going to be, having a plan in place in advance, and then supporting the action on that plan. And then last, really zooming out and recognizing that action in individual buildings is absolutely essential to eliminating GHG emissions and overall decarbonization. And at the same time, there are parallel issues that really extend beyond individual buildings, particularly with regard to leakage and seismic safety, and our shared cost burden from maintaining a natural gas distribution infrastructure and potentially its ultimate transition or decommissioning. And that the city really needs to be looking both to how to engage the individual building owner and the tenant, as well as partnering with our utilities and our state partners to get that done. And that will conclude my remarks, but the way that body of work, a key element of how it reconnects back to benchmarking is in that idea of planning, being prepared for opportunities for upgrades, and to really recognize when and where there are going to be triggers and opportunities for investment. So I'll pause there and hand it back to you, Emily.